The meeting takes place on a Friday morning in April 1998. It is not a public meeting. There are no cameras, no reporters, no record that will be easily found. It is a phone call, later described by those present as a conference call, between four of the most powerful figures in American economic policy. On one side, Brooksley Born, chair of the Commodity Futures Trading Commission. She has sent a document to the other participants, a modest, carefully worded proposal suggesting that a specific corner of the financial markets, one growing at a speed that no one fully understood, might benefit from some regulatory oversight. On the other side, Alan Greenspan, chairman of the Federal Reserve, Robert Rubin, Secretary of the Treasury, Larry Summers, Deputy Secretary of the Treasury. What happens next will not make the newspapers, but 10 years later it will cost the global economy $11 trillion. The 2008 financial crisis is usually told as a story about greed, about bankers who took too many risks, regulators who fell asleep, a system that grew too complex for anyone to control. That story is not wrong, but it is incomplete. Because there was a woman who saw it coming, who identified the precise instrument, credit default swaps and over-the-counter derivatives, that would detonate the crisis, who put her warning in writing, routed it through the proper channels, and presented it to the people whose job it was to act on exactly this kind of information. And those people did not fail to understand her. They understood her perfectly, and they shut her down anyway. This is the story of Brooksley Born, and it is not a story about one woman. It is a story about what happens when the people guarding the system have a personal interest in leaving the door unlocked. Brooksley Born did not arrive in Washington as an outsider. She had spent decades as a partner at Arnold & Porter, one of Washington's most prestigious law firms, where she had become one of the country's leading experts in financial derivatives, the complex instruments that allow investors to make bets on the future price of assets without actually owning those assets. She understood derivatives not as an abstraction but as a practitioner. She had spent years inside the machinery. When President Clinton appointed her to chair the Commodity Futures Trading Commission in 1996, she was not a crusader. She was not a populist. She was a technical expert who had been given a technical job, overseeing a regulatory agency responsible for policing a specific segment of the financial markets. The CFTC was not a glamorous posting. It was not the Federal Reserve or the Treasury. It sat in a mid-level office building and regulated futures and options markets, corn prices, oil contracts, currency bets. Most of Washington barely knew it existed, but Born noticed something. In the 1990s, a new class of financial instrument had been quietly growing in the space between regulated markets. Over-the-counter derivatives, contracts negotiated directly between two private parties, outside any exchange, outside any clearinghouse, outside any reporting requirement, were expanding at a pace that defied easy measurement. By the late 1990s, the notional value of these contracts was in the tens of trillions of dollars. And no one, not the Federal Reserve, not the Treasury, not the Securities and Exchange Commission, had clear authority to see inside them. Born believed the CFTC did have that authority. More importantly, she believed that without some form of oversight, this market represented a systemic risk that could, under the wrong conditions, threaten the broader financial system. She began drafting what would be called a concept release, a regulatory document that did not propose specific rules, but simply asked, should we be looking at this more carefully? It was, by the standards of financial regulation, an extraordinarily measured document. It was also, it turned out, an act of war. Alan Greenspan called her personally. According to Bourne's own later account, Greenspan told her that he did not believe fraud was possible in financial markets, because the participants, being sophisticated professionals, would always act in their own rational self-interest and self-correct. Regulation, he suggested, was not only unnecessary but potentially harmful. It would introduce uncertainty into a market that functioned precisely because it was free of government interference. Bourne listened, and then she continued her work. What followed was not a debate, it was a campaign. Greenspan, Rubin, and Summers moved together, something that was itself unusual, given the institutional rivalries between the Fed, Treasury, and the White House, to contain Bourne before her concept release could become policy. They brought their objections to Congress. They briefed financial industry lobbyists. They argued, publicly and privately, that Bourne's proposal would create legal uncertainty, damage American competitiveness, and destabilize markets that were functioning perfectly well without her intervention. The financial industry, which had grown enormously profitable on the back of unregulated derivatives, provided its own pressure. In April 1998, the four of them had the phone call. Summers, according to later congressional testimony, told Bourne that he had 13 bankers in his office who had told him that her proposal would cause the worst financial crisis since the Second World War. The irony of that sentence would not become fully visible for another decade. Bourne released the concept release anyway in May 1998. The response was immediate. Congress, prompted by the financial industry and supported by Greenspan and Rubin, passed emergency legislation ordering the CFTC to take no action on over-the-counter derivatives for 6 months while a study was conducted. It was a legislative freeze aimed at a single regulator. Then, in the summer of 1998, something happened that seemed to validate Bourne's concerns entirely. Long-term capital management, a hedge fund run by Nobel Prize-winning economists, leveraged to an almost incomprehensible degree through derivatives contracts, collapsed. The Federal Reserve had to organize a private bailout of $3.6 billion to prevent the failure from cascading through the financial system. Bourne pointed to it. Here, she said, is exactly what I warned about. Greenspan, Rubin, and Summers looked at the same event and drew the opposite conclusion. The system had handled it, they said. The private sector had self-corrected. No new regulation was needed. In 1999, Brooksley Born resigned from the CFTC. Later that same year, Congress passed the Commodity Futures Modernization Act, which did not merely leave over-the-counter derivatives unregulated, but explicitly and permanently prohibited any federal agency from regulating them. The door was not just left unlocked, it was welded open. Between 1999 and 2007, the derivatives market Bourne had warned about grew from tens of trillions to hundreds of trillions in notional value. The instrument at the center of it was the credit default swap, a contract that functioned like insurance on debt, allowing banks to bet on whether loans would be repaid, without owning the loans themselves, without holding capital against the risk, and without any central registry that would allow anyone to know the total exposure in the system. By 2007, the notional value of outstanding credit default swaps alone was estimated at over $62 trillion. The entire GDP of planet Earth that year was approximately $65 trillion. When the housing market began to crack in 2007, the connections between these contracts and the mortgage-backed securities they referenced became visible for the first time. Banks that had sold protection on mortgage debt found themselves facing obligations they could not meet. Banks that had bought protection found that the counterparties on the other side of their contracts were insolvent. The web of exposure was so dense, so opaque, that no institution, including the Federal Reserve, could accurately assess who owed what to whom. In September 2008, Lehman Brothers filed for bankruptcy. Within days, the Reserve Primary Fund, a money market fund, broke the dollar. AIG, which had written $440 billion in credit default swaps, required a federal bailout of $182 billion to prevent its collapse from taking the entire financial system with it. Credit markets froze. Stock markets fell. Governments around the world mobilized trillions in emergency support. $11 trillion in household wealth was destroyed in the United States alone. 8 million jobs disappeared. Millions of families lost their homes. The instrument Brooksley Born had identified in 1998 was at the center of all of it. In 2009, Born was awarded the John F. Kennedy Profiles in Courage Award. The citation read that she stood firm in the face of fierce opposition from powerful interests. She accepted it quietly. She did not say, "I told you so." She did not need to. In 2010, Congress passed the Dodd-Frank Act, the most sweeping financial regulation since the New Deal. One of its central provisions was the regulation of over-the-counter derivatives markets, requiring them to be traded on exchanges, cleared through central counterparties, and reported to trade repositories. It was, in its essential architecture, what Brooksley Born had proposed in 1998. It came 12 years too late for the 8 million people who lost their jobs. It came too late for the families who lost their homes. It came too late for the pension funds, the retirement accounts, the small businesses that did not survive the credit freeze of 2008. Alan Greenspan testified before Congress in October 2008 in the weeks after the crisis broke. He told the committee that he had found a flaw his word in his model of how markets work, that the assumption of rational self-interest, the assumption he had used to dismiss Brooksley Born a decade earlier, had not held. He was 82 years old. The flaw, of course, was not new. Born had named it in 1998. The difference was not information. The difference was power. Born was not ignored because she was wrong. She was not silenced because her analysis was flawed or her data was insufficient or her proposal was legally incoherent. She was silenced because the people with the power to act on her warning had spent their careers in a world that told them deregulated markets were not just efficient, they were morally correct. And because the financial industry, which stood to lose enormous profits under any regulatory oversight, had the access, the resources, and the relationships to make that silence happen. Every major systemic failure has a Brooksley Born. Someone inside the system, using the system's own tools, raising the alarm through the proper channels. And every major systemic failure has its Greenspan, its Rubin, its Summers, not villains in the cinematic sense, but men so embedded in a particular way of seeing the world that a warning, however precise, however documented, simply could not penetrate the certainty of their assumptions. The question the story of Brooksley Born leaves us with is not, why didn't they listen? The question is, who is being silenced right now, and what will it cost us when the clock runs out?